Thank you very much, Ara and David. So my name is Mustafa. 6 years ago, I started a company called DeepMind Technologies. And our ambition was to solve general intelligence. And the basic assumption, kind of crazy as it probably sounds, but the basic assumption was that this thing up here, our minds, our intelligences, has been responsible for delivering all kinds of incredible benefits in our societies. In fact, our entire civilization is a product of this intelligent system that sits in my mind, creating beautiful, powerful, incredible, and genius things. And if we could somehow distill into an algorithmic construct some of the essence of my own intelligence into useful tools, software, that we could use to make the world a better place, then potentially we could use this to address some of our most pressing social challenges. That's where we started as a company. Where we are today is that a couple years ago, we decided that it was best to join forces with Google. And now we run as a separate research organization as a subsidiary of Google, running independently with our own control. We have about 200 or so of the world's leading machine learning and AI researchers, and we've published about 100 or so peer-reviewed academic publications. The very large majority of our algorithms are open and in the public domain. But of course, we're also founded fundamentally with a social mission. And it's with this that we're able to combine, I think, the very best that a long-term focus on very hard problems comes with being an academic organization, with our research focus, but also with the pace and the scale and the agility of a startup-style company, relatively small as we are, able to take on new challenges very quickly, prototype and design new systems, but with the scale and the resources of a very large company backing us. And all the while, we underpin this with the social impact values that make us who we are, that make us focused on addressing tough social problems, much like in the public sector. A couple of the notable successes that we've had in the last couple of years is that we were able to train an agent or a system to take raw data from the Atari emulator. So this is the old school Atari games, Space Invaders and Breakout. And using just the raw pixels, we were able to train an agent to play at human-level performance any of these games independently. So through self-play, through interacting dynamically with the system, it was able to perform as well as the very best humans across all 56 games. And so this is really beginning to touch on the kind of generality and the skills that we have as humans. That's one of the things that makes us unique, in that we can learn to ride a bicycle and use that knowledge to ride a motorbike or learn to ride a motorbike more efficiently. And we were lucky enough to get a Nature front cover for this work. We then extended that to the classic problem of Go. So it's an ancient Chinese game that's 3,500 years old, and it's played on a 19 by 19 board. So it's much, much more complicated than the game of chess. There are something like 10 to the power of 170 possible configurations of the board in the game of Go. So the complexity of this search space is absolutely enormous. In fact, it's been estimated that there are something like 10 to the power of 70 atoms in the known universe. So in every liquid, solid, and gas in the known universe, there are in fact many, many, many more potential state spaces, configurations of the board in a game of Go than there are atoms in the known universe. And so traditional methods for search, where we basically apply a rule based on human intuition, a structured rule that we can express in language, simply don't work. And that's why for a very long time, despite creating algorithms that can beat the best human players at chess, we've not managed to do that in Go until we were able to beat the world champion 3 or 4 months ago in a live match in Korea. So that's some of the context for who we are as a company. Moving on to some of the work that we've actually done in partnering with Google, we've worked on all of Google's core products to try and make them better. But one thing that we were really motivated to do, largely because of the environmental impact that we get by reducing Google's power used for data center cooling by a whopping 40%. This was the largest single improvement that the company had seen in the history of its data centers. And the interesting thing here is that this directly correlates to a reduction in energy consumed in order to power the largest compute infrastructure in the world. So these are the sorts of things that one can start to do now when we have useful data that's structured in the right way and where we have a neat prediction to try and improve the way that a system operates. And so returning to our core aim, our core motivation is to try to use our technologies and our expertise to make the world a better place. And that was the context and in that light that we decided that now was the time for us to start DeepMind Health. We launched in February earlier this year at the Royal Society of Medicine in front of more than 400 or so clinicians. And we outlined our ambition to try to take our technologies to use some of the data that is available, to try to digitize some of the data that already exists but operates largely on paper, and try to make much better predictions that nurses and doctors can use to help run our frontline services more efficiently. And this speaks very much to what you'll all be familiar with as the triple aim, where we try to deliver much better health with enhanced patient care, and all the while at a lower cost. But I think the thing that we've managed to identify over the last couple of years in collaboration with Ara and his team of researchers is that if it isn't actually being measured, it won't be improved. And so one of the real challenges for us is, can we take the existing stuff that's already been digitized, combine that with the stuff that's already on paper, and add to that the data that's being exchanged all the time over telephones, in conversations, on pages, and so on and so forth. Because at the moment, much of the data looks like this. So although in some senses it's very rich, we have OBS, we have fluid charts, we have diet charts here, we've got stool charts, for example, all sorts of very rich data that's being collected across the system that exists largely on paper, and so as a result ends up being not that actionable, and that's part of the challenge here. Combined with the fact that we do, at the moment, it seems, a lot of the communication still relies on pages and so forth in the hospital. You know, certainly when we first started exploring the system and collaborating with partners in the NHS, I think we were pretty surprised to see that pages were still in use. You know, I think it's very rare to see these days that a technology which is sort of 20 years old or so is being used at the front line of services. And I think many of the nurses and doctors that we spoke to, both in our research and in our collaborations, are kind of mystified that today we're using pages and in some cases fax machines, and then we can go home and we can share our photos with our family and play games with the most cutting-edge, beautiful mobile UIs, and yet when we're saving lives every day, we're sort of struggling with these very outdated, arcane technologies. And part of the research that Ara and Dominic have shown has revealed some really striking anecdotal results, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Why does it take me an hour or so to learn how to prescribe paracetamol, and things like, I don't think I'm stupid, but it couldn't be any more complicated. And so really the bar for us is very clear. Just like you do when you learn an app, there's no training course, there's no detailed manual. It should be intuitive, it should be instinctive, it should be second nature, and you should be able to figure it out just by interacting with the app. And so there are four core pillars that we think a truly digital NHS will enable. The first is massively improved patient care. The second is actionable analytics that arise from us being able to digitize most of the data that's exchanged across the system and make that available to clinicians and managers to do things like much more advanced research, both at the hospital-wide level and at the population-wide level. And then finally, I think it will enable an open innovation system through true interoperability. That will enable us to bring a wide variety of providers into the system and for clinicians up and down the country to be able to commission much smaller, much more nimble, startup-like organizations to provide some of the long tail of specialist and niche applications that nurses and doctors are asking for. So a quick look at what digitization could actually deliver with respect to improved patient care. I want to take you through a case study or a narrative that's based on the fundamental idea that the first challenge is really to use the existing data that has already been digitized, combine that with the data that sits on paper, and try to identify which patients are at risk of deterioration. And when we know that more efficiently and more safely and more quickly, escalate the appropriate intervention and the care that's actually required through better task management, better communications, and better coordination of that individual patient's care. So here we have a patient, Robert, who's been admitted recently with an abdominal pain and has stayed in overnight for observations. Here we see the ward nurse has access to a mobile app and is taking the temperature of Robert and is able to input the data on the mobile device at the bedside, immediately scrub through and very neatly and very clearly enter that this patient actually has a temperature of 39.2 degrees, and so we see that the news score has gone up accordingly. And that automatically should send an alert to the doctor on call to say, okay, there's some concern here, we need someone to take another look. And here we have Sarah, the junior doctor, on her own mobile who's received this alert or notification and is walking towards the bedside. And during that time, she's able to review everything about that patient, a detailed patient profile, every bit of data that exists in the system today in one single canonical feed. She searches for the patient across any ward, any specialty, any consultant, across the entire hospital. Immediately, she's presented with an overview, the most important pieces of information that she needs to do a quick exam, including things like underlying diagnosis. She can see here that this patient's had their tonsils out recently by looking at past procedures. She can see the medication that the patient is on. And she can also see the most recent observations, where we now see that the blood pressure has actually risen to 110/80. If we swipe across, we can see the same data presented in a different kind of stream. Here we have the linear record of all the events that have happened to that patient in admission. So she doesn't have to arrive at the bedside, scramble for the notes, attend to a bunch of different systems, and of course the worst thing, which is ask the patient what's happened to them in this admission, ask them to recall exactly what's happened to them. But no, she actually has, in a consistent timeline, all of the information that she needs to make a judgment about what's happened in the last 24, 48 hours. And of course, she can view a lot more detail on the specific results. Here we're looking at the urea and electrolytes, where she can also see that the creatinine has recently spiked over the last 24 hours. She swipes back. She can also see that the patient just yesterday had a chest X-ray. Here we have both the image and the radiology report, where we see that there's a suspected pneumonia. She can zoom in and examine the image in more detail. And all this happens before she gets to the patient's bedside. So now, as she's having a conversation with Robert and examining him face-to-face more closely, what she's able to identify is that the patient does, in fact, need, it looks like an operation. It looks like this patient may need an appendectomy. And so immediately she's able to securely message and communicate with the consultant on call. And this is the piece that's really important. How do we very quickly escalate this condition to what's obviously required? And so she has a text message exchange both with the consultant and, as we can see here, with the ward nurse, all of whom are able to communicate what set of actions need to happen given that this patient requires escalation. The consultant, pictured here, Maddie, is able to examine the past history, check on the diagnosis of the junior doctor, and is herself then able to advise that we need to go into surgery immediately. We start by issuing a new job, which she's able to select from the drop-down menu, prepare for surgery. And we can see all of the subtasks that are associated with that. So to zoom in a little bit here, we can see that this patient needs to be nil by mouth. Somebody needs to put an IV line in. We need antibiotics signed off. We need fluids, consents, and so on and so forth. And so automatically, each of these jobs that is associated with this operation are dispatched to the appropriate person. And of course, after Robert's operation, we can also continue to remotely examine all of the key respiratory rates, as well as SATs and temperature, and any other obs that are associated right at the side of the patient's bed. Here we have an example of the consultant remotely able to review on her personal mobile the appropriate information that's relevant to her remote monitoring. This is something that Ara mentioned to me repeatedly, that often a consultant after surgery likes to keep track of what's been happening to that patient, and it's really difficult to get access to that data so that they can help continue to coordinate care after surgery. And ultimately, of course, we really want to make sure that we put the patient back in control of their own data. It's the patient who owns their data, and it's the patient who we want to empower to take responsibility for participating in the management of their own care. So here we see Robert back at home or in a coffee shop afterwards, able to review the fact that he's been sent an alert or a notification that it's time for him to have a follow-up appointment, a routine follow-up appointment, and he can also examine a bunch of the data associated with his previous admission. So it's the first steps towards the patient getting control of more of their data, and in time thinking about how this is linked with primary care, tertiary care, and other sorts of data that are very relevant. And of course, all of this information is a great opportunity for us to generate actionable analytics so that the hospital itself, the clinicians at the ward level and at the hospital-wide level, can do real-time continuous improvement. And so these are the kinds of metrics that we understand people to be very interested in, things like what are the news scores across my entire ward for all the different patients, and can I optimally match those needy patients, the patients who are most in need, with the right kind of staff that I have available for this week's forthcoming rota, for example, and many, many other things. The key thing is that if you can do structured search across all of the data that's available in the hospital, actually, it's up to clinicians and managers, nurses, and people who are providing care at the front line to decide which pieces of data they want to see at which time. And so it's a very general, inherently flexible platform that can be adapted by people at the front line to the local context. And of course, this kind of digitization will massively transform, I think, the research agenda. And so two of the projects that we've been working on most recently, one is a brilliant collaboration with the Moorfields Eye Hospital, where we've been looking at retinal scans for diabetes and macular degeneration. If you do have diabetes, you're 20 to 25 times more likely to suffer some kind of sight loss. And in fact, 98% of the most severe forms of that sight loss is actually preventable, entirely preventable, if you can get in there early. And so what we're doing is training some of our algorithms to try to identify those particular features in the scans so that we can speed up diagnoses and the right ophthalmologist can make the appropriate interventions. In the same vein with UCLH, we're working on radiotherapy planning for head and neck cancers. So this is before you go into the provision of radiotherapy treatment. An expert radiologist has to sit there and label the scan pixel by pixel in order to pick out the specific areas that need to be targeted with the radiotherapy treatment. And there's currently a 28-day wait time just to get to this pre-planning stage, which itself takes around 4 hours or so. And so with a 10x or so shortage of radiologists predicted over the next decade, this is really something that we think could speed up and improve outcomes significantly. So finally, bringing this together, I think it's really important to stress that we set out to build clinician-led technology. All of the projects that we've worked on so far have been brought to me or brought to my team by nurses and doctors directly themselves. And they're the projects that we love. They're the things that we want to collaborate on. So if anybody has ideas for projects that they want to collaborate on with us, please email us at sayhi@deepmindhealth.com. The other thing to say is that we're absolutely committed to open standards and interoperability. In fact, we think this is going to be the key pivotal thing which is going to unlock the kind of innovation that this system really, really needs. And that's going to be a default part of our approach. As I've mentioned, it's so important that in all that we do here, we put the patient first. Ultimately, patient owns this data, and ultimately, patient will be empowered to help manage their own care and take responsibility for their own care with access to their own data. We also recognize that having patients at the heart of our own decision-making process is critical. So on the 20th of September this month, we're going to be launching our first PPIE event. 120 people have already signed up, and they're going to be coming into the offices in London. It's going to be streamed live on YouTube. All of you are welcome to come. It's going to be a 3-hour session with me and my entire team, and it's going to be moderated by the patient editor from the BMJ. So they're going to be running the session, and it will be an opportunity for everybody here to come and make suggestions, give us critical feedback, and help us to do this in exactly the right way, led by patients. Finally, I want to touch on governance and say a little bit about our panel of independent reviewers. On the day that we launched DeepMind Health at the Royal Society of Medicine, I announced that we would be putting together a panel of unpaid independent reviewers who are there to scrutinize us in the public interest. they're not bound by any contract or any NDA. They can say publicly whatever they want about what they see, and we have offered to share with them our data sharing agreements, our product roadmaps, and insight into our technical systems. They can diligence our technical infrastructure and our architectures, and we've given them a budget so that they can hire a secretariat and a series of consultants and technical experts to help investigate what we're working on. And this is so that we have a group of people who can speak to the public and represent the public's interests, and also verify that the things that I'm getting up and saying are actually consistent with what we're actually doing behind the scenes. And I think we have an exceptional panel ranging from Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, to Julian Huppert, who's chair of Cambridge CCG, to Donal O'Donoghue, Matthew Taylor, and of course, Martin Bromley, and so on and so forth, many of the names that you'll be familiar with. We're really committed to this, and if anybody has any feedback or any advice for how we can improve this, please get in touch with me directly. My email is mustafa@deepmind.com, and I'm always excited to hear from anybody who wants to give us feedback, come to us with collaborations, and get more involved. So thank you very much.
Great.